A brittle wind howled through the skeletal remains of the old industrial town, carrying with it the sharp tang of rust and decay. The horizon was painted in muted grays and browns, a grim canvas of factories whose crumbling frames clawed at the overcast evening sky. Streets, long abandoned, were fractured by weeds and dotted with the remains of old vehicles, their steel shells weathered to jagged ruins. Somewhere in the distance, a city's broken skyline loomed like a phantom, barely visible through a haze of fog and desolation. The ride had been mostly silent so far. Venturing out from the settlement was always an incredible risk, and this mission would be no different. Each trip required them to go further into the ruin, each supply harder to find, and fought over more desperately. Jagged metal and crumbling streets weren't the only dangers out here. Roving bands of marauders, chemical spills, and radiation zones were all hazards they had faced in the past. The space-suit-like hazard gear they wore was stuffy and uncomfortable, but better than the slow death of radiation poisoning. Ezra rode shotgun in the settlement's largest vehicle. His sharp eyes scanned the street ahead, searching for movement in the ruins. Around him, the rumble of their scavenged transport hummed softly, its makeshift armor cobbled together from scrap metal and old industrial plating. "Sinkhole," Ezra muttered, pointing to a dark depression in the street ahead. The asphalt had collapsed inward, revealing a gaping maw of darkness beneath. The faint sound of dripping water echoed from below. "Stick to the edges," he instructed. "These streets are falling apart." As Mira maneuvered around the sinkhole, the group's conversation turned to the unsettling rumors that had reached their settlement in recent months. "You think it's true?" Owen asked hesitantly, breaking the silence. "About those whistlers? That they've made it this far north?" Jace scoffed, but his grip on his rifle tightened. "They're stories, kid. Campfire tales to scare scavengers and keep them from wandering too far south. The Spire's ruins are their territory, not here. No one has cared about the Rust Belt in over a century." Mira frowned. "And yet, the stories keep coming. Travelers disappearing, settlements going silent. What if they're not just rumors?" Ezra didn't respond immediately. "Stay focused," he said finally, his voice low. "We're here for coolant, not ghost stories." Owen swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the shadows. "We clear?" Mira whispered, her voice muffled by the scarf wrapped around her face. She tightened her grip on the rusted wrench strapped to her belt, her other hand tight on the steering wheel. Ezra nodded, his expression grim. Jace leaned against the side of the transport, his rifle cradled in his arms. His eyes never stopped moving, tracking every shadow that danced across the ruins. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Too quiet. Raiders, mutants, something's usually out here." Ezra stood, his silhouette framed against the jagged skyline. "We stick to the plan. In and out. No distractions." Owen fidgeted with the strap of his backpack. His gaze flicked between the others, a mix of eagerness and nervous energy etched into his features. "We'll find it, right? The coolant?" Ezra's eyes softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "If it's there, we'll get it. Stick close and do exactly as I say." The truck slowed to a halt and they all exited. The group pressed forward, their boots crunching over shattered glass and debris. A manufacturing plant rose ahead of them like a monolith, its rust-streaked walls towering over the skeletal remains of nearby buildings. Broken windows stared down like hollow eyes, and the massive double doors hung ajar, swaying faintly in the wind. Owen's eyes darted to every darkened doorway and pile of rubble, the weight of his unease practically tangible. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it faint echoes. Ezra paused, holding up a hand. The group stopped, their breaths shallow. They all scanned the area, searching for threats, but none were visible. After a brief pause, they continued. The deeper they ventured into the ruins, the more unsettling the environment became. They passed a steel gate twisted out of shape, its bars bent, as though something massive had forced its way through long ago. The interior of the plant was a mausoleum of industry, its once bustling halls now echoing with an oppressive silence. Conveyor belts lay frozen in mid-motion, their surfaces thick with decades of dust. Robotic arms, skeletal and inert, jutted out from rusted assembly lines like the broken limbs of forgotten titans. Mira knelt near a collapsed workstation, her fingers brushing aside debris to reveal a corroded console. "This place is ancient," she muttered, her voice laced with both awe and unease. "The systems are fried, but if the coolant tanks are still sealed, they might have survived." "Get us to them," Ezra said, his voice low. "We don't have time to admire the scenery." Jace moved to a nearby window, his rifle at the ready. "I've got a bad feeling about this place," he said, peering into the shadows beyond the factory floor. "Feels wrong." Owen lingered near the entrance, his gaze darting nervously to the yawning darkness that stretched deeper into the facility. "Why would anyone abandon all this? It's like they just left." Ezra's jaw tightened. People didn't leave, they ran, and they didn't have time to take anything with them. Mira's voice cut through the uneasy silence. "Found it," she said, pointing to a rusted stairwell leading to the lower levels. "Coolant storage should be in the sub-level." Ezra nodded, gesturing for the group to move. "Let's go." The descent was suffocating. The air grew colder and heavier with each step, carrying the faint metallic scent of old machinery mixed with something fouler, something that lingered at the edge of recognition. The sub-level opened into a vast storage chamber, its walls lined with towering tanks marked with faded hazard symbols. Mira's eyes lit up as she approached one of the tanks, running her hand along its surface. "This one's intact," she said, her voice tinged with relief. "We'll need time to transfer it into the containers. But it's going to take time to extract. The pumps are shot, so I'll have to rig something." Ezra nodded. "Do it. We'll cover you. Make it quick. We don't stay longer than we have to." Owen stayed close to Jace, his eyes wide as he took in the oppressive shadows. "What's that smell?" he whispered. Jace frowned, sniffing the air. It was faint but distinct. Something organic, rotting. "No idea. Stay sharp," he said, gripping his rifle tighter. As Mira worked, Ezra moved to inspect the chamber's perimeter. His flashlight played across the walls, illuminating faint scratches etched into the metal. The marks weren't random. They formed deliberate, almost geometric patterns. "What is this?" he muttered, running his fingers along the grooves. Jace joined him, his expression darkening. "Doesn't look natural," he said. "Could be raiders marking territory." Ezra shook his head. "No, this is something else." From deeper within the sub-level, a faint sound reached their ears. A low, melodic whistle that sent a chill down Ezra's spine. Mira froze, her hands hovering over the makeshift pump. "What was that?" Owen stepped closer to Jace, his voice trembling. "It's just the wind, right? Has to be the wind." Ezra's hand tightened around his weapon. "Wind doesn't make that sound," he said quietly. The sound grew louder, reverberating through the chamber. It was hauntingly rhythmic, almost like a song, yet it carried an undercurrent of malice. Mira worked faster, her hands shaking as she secured the coolant containers. "Just a little longer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra motioned for Jace to cover the stairwell, eyes open. "Whatever's making that noise, it's close." Jace positioned himself at the base of the stairs, his rifle trained on the shadows above. The whistling seemed to shift, moving through the facility like a predator circling its prey. "Steady," Ezra said, his voice firm despite the growing tension. "We hold this position until Mira's done." Jace's grip on his rifle tightened as the whistling reached a crescendo, echoing off the walls like a sinister chant, and then silence. It was worse than the sound. Ezra's voice cut through the stillness. "Mira, how much longer?" She didn't look up. 2 minutes, just 2 more minutes." From the darkness above, something shifted. The containers were full, but carrying them was difficult under the circumstances. They each had to hold one, making their rifles almost useless. It was time to head back to the stairs and get out of here. Ezra led the way, his rifle held tightly in one hand, scanning the surrounding ruins with sharp, calculating eyes. Mira followed close behind, her toolkit jangling softly at her side. Owen trailed nervously, his eyes darting to every darkened doorway and pile of rubble, the weight of his unease practically tangible. The wind howled through the empty building, carrying with it faint echoes that sounded too deliberate to be natural. Ezra paused, holding up a hand. The group stopped, their breaths shallow. Jace climbed onto a catwalk, his rifle trained on the darkened corners of the factory. From his vantage point he could see the entire floor, but the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, playing tricks on his eyes. Owen stayed close to Mira, his hands gripping his crowbar tightly. Every creak of the factory's aging infrastructure made him jump. "Relax," Mira said without looking up. "You're making me nervous." "Sorry," Owen muttered, his voice trembling. "This place just feels wrong." There was a sharp clang from somewhere deep within the factory. The sound echoed like a gunshot, sending a chill down everyone's spine. "What was that?" Jace called from above. Ezra's voice was calm but firm. "It's probably just the building settling." Another clang, louder this time, followed by a faint scraping sound. "Buildings don't settle like that," Mira said. Above them the shadows stretched long and deep, swallowing corners and twisting in ways that felt unnatural. The air was heavy, oppressive, filled with the faint tang of rust and oil. And then the whistling returned. "Do you hear that?" Owen whispered, his voice trembling. "We all hear it," Ezra muttered. "Keep moving." The whistling grew louder, reverberating through the factory like a ghostly tune. Closer and closer. It appeared as a shadow at first, a darker shape against the gloom, hunched and angular. Ezra's flashlight caught it for just a moment. 3 elongated arms gripping a rusted beam, its pyramid-like head tilting unnaturally. Rows of small black eyes reflected the beam of light like polished stones. "A whistler," Owen said in an awed, hushed tone. "Contact," Jace barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The thing moved with perfect precision, shifting its weight without a sound. It dropped from the girder, landing on the factory floor with a soft thud, its limbs splaying out like a grotesque spider. Jace fired immediately, his shot striking the creature square in the chest. It staggered but didn't fall. It tilted its head toward Jace, as if studying him, and then lunged. "Open fire!" Ezra shouted, his rifle erupting in a hail of gunfire. The rounds tore into the whistler, green bioluminescent fluid spraying from the wounds, but it didn't stop, its needle-like fingers slashing as it closed the distance. Jace fired again, this time aiming for its legs. The creature faltered, momentarily dropping to one knee before springing upward with unnatural agility. "More of them!" Mira screamed. Shapes emerged from the machinery above. 2, 3, 4 whistlers, their black chitinous shells gleaming faintly in the dim light. They moved in eerie synchronization, descending from the catwalks and beams like shadows given life. Mira yelled to Owen, "Get the coolant upstairs, now!" One of the whistlers darted toward Owen, its elongated limbs scraping against the floor with a sound that set his teeth on edge. Its head tilted, and for a moment it just stared at him. "Owen, move!" Mira shouted. The creature lunged, its needle-like fingers outstretched. Owen panicked, dropping the coolant container. He grabbed his weapon, a crowbar, and swung wildly. The metal struck the whistler's arm with a sickening crack, knocking it back just enough for him to scramble away. "Help him," Ezra ordered, firing a burst of rounds at the advancing whistlers. Jace, still on the catwalk, targeted another creature, his sniper rifle cracking through the cacophony. One of the whistlers fell, its chest blown open, then struggled to rise, but the others adapted, moving erratically, dodging his shots with inhuman precision. "Almost there," she yelled, struggling the last few steps. Ezra and Jace fought to hold the creatures back, their gunfire echoing through the factory. One whistler managed to flank them, leaping onto the catwalk where Jace was positioned. "Jace, behind you!" Ezra shouted. Jace spun just in time, firing point blank into the creature's face. It shrieked, its head snapping back, but its clawed hand lashed out, slicing through Jace's shoulder armor. He cried out, stumbling but managing to fire another shot, sending the whistler plummeting to the floor below. It landed with a wet crack, like an egg dropped on the floor. "Jace, fall back," Ezra ordered. "Not yet," Jace snarled, taking another shot at a whistler closing in. The whistlers weren't mindless. They moved with purpose, their elongated limbs darting in and out of the shadows as they probed for weaknesses. One climbed a rusted column, its head swiveling toward Mira as she ran. Ezra noticed too late. "Mira, above you!" he shouted, firing. No time to aim. The whistler dropped, landing near her. Another whistler darted from the shadows, and Ezra fired, emptying his magazine into its chest. Jace came down from the catwalk to join the others. "Move, move!" Ezra shouted, shoving Jace up the stairs. The whistlers didn't give chase. They stood in the shadows below, their heads tilted, watching, waiting. The whistling slowed, becoming a low, haunting hum. "They're letting us go. Have they had enough?" she whispered. Ezra reloaded his rifle, his jaw clenched. "No, they're studying us." The factory was behind them, but the whistling lingered, carried on the wind like a sinister melody that promised they weren't safe. The scavengers fled back into the factory's maze-like ground floor, their boots pounding against cracked concrete as the relentless whistling lingered behind them. The whistlers pursued cautiously, their jagged limbs scraping against walls and beams, the sound a chilling accompaniment to the panicked rhythm of the scavengers' movements. Ezra led the charge, his rifle clutched tightly as his eyes scanned the decayed infrastructure for anything that could slow the nightmare closing in behind them. The factory's corroded skeleton became their battlefield, its crumbling machinery and rotting beams their only allies. The team reached a wide corridor lined with rusted shelving units that once held industrial components. Ezra skidded to a halt, his sharp gaze locking onto a massive, unstable rack leaning precariously against the wall. "Keep moving, I'll hold them," Ezra barked, shoving Owen and Mira forward. A whistler emerged from the shadows, its elongated limbs moving fluidly as it crept closer, its pyramid-like head tilting at an extreme angle. Ezra aimed at the base of the shelving unit, his rifle barking as bullets ripped through corroded bolts. The structure groaned and trembled, then collapsed with a deafening crash, tons of rusted steel raining down, burying the whistler beneath it. The creature's screech was muffled as the weight crushed its spindly frame, green bioluminescent fluid oozing from beneath the rubble. Ezra didn't stop to celebrate. "Go!" he shouted, reloading as he ran to catch up with the others. The team reached a cavernous section of the factory, its ceiling lost in the shadows above. Rusted catwalks crisscrossed the space, some hanging by frayed cables, others partially collapsed. Jace spotted an intact section and scrambled up, his sniper rifle slung over his back. He struggled to get to the top due to his injury. "I'll cover you from up here," he called down, his voice echoing. From his elevated position, Jace scanned the area with his rifle's scope. The whistlers were coming, their movements deliberate as they navigated the debris-strewn floor. He exhaled slowly, his finger tightening on the trigger. The first shot rang out, a rail-thin whistler struck through the head. Jace adjusted, tracking another target. His second shot struck a creature mid-leap, sending it crashing into a rusted beam. Each shot bought the team precious seconds, but the creatures kept coming. "Jace, we need to move," Mira shouted from below as she struggled to drag the coolant containers through the rubble. "Just keep going," Jace snarled, firing another round. But the whistlers were learning. One of them scaled the wall, its clawed limbs digging into the metal as it closed the distance to Jace's perch. He turned just in time, firing point blank into its chest. The creature shrieked and fell, but not before raking its claws across his leg, tearing through armor and flesh. Jace gritted his teeth against the pain, blood pooling inside his suit. He limped back toward the ladder, firing one-handed as another whistler began to climb. Owen trailed behind the others, his crowbar clutched tightly in his gloved hands. The air inside the factory was stale, heavy with the scent of rust and decay. His boots scuffed against the concrete floor. But Owen's attention wavered, drawn to the oppressive weight of the place. Every creak of metal, every faint groan of the factory's decaying structure felt alive, purposeful. The others disappeared around a corner, leaving him momentarily alone in the labyrinth of machinery. That's when he heard it. A faint, melodic whistle. Barely perceptible, it floated through the still air. Owen froze. "Guys?" he called out, his voice cracking slightly. The word echoed back to him, distorted and hollow. No response. A sharp metallic crash erupted behind him, the sound ricocheting through the factory like a gunshot. Owen spun, his heart pounding in his chest. A pile of rusted steel beams had toppled across the corridor, cutting him off from the others. The whistling grew louder, still faint, but now layered with an eerie cadence that seemed to crawl under his skin. "Ezra!" he yelled, panic lacing his voice. He ran to the barricade of twisted metal and tried to push it aside, but the beams were too heavy, their rusted edges grinding against the floor. He could barely hear his own ragged breathing over the insistent whistling, which seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Above him, something moved. Owen's gaze shot upward, his breath catching in his throat. A figure clung to the beams above, its elongated limbs gripping the rusted supports with a horrifying grace. Its head, pyramid-like and unnaturally angled, tilted slowly, rows of black reflective eyes gleaming in the dim light. For a moment it didn't move. It simply watched him. "Guys," Owen whispered, his voice trembling. He took a step back, his boots slipping slightly on the dusty floor. The whistler shifted its weight, its movements impossibly smooth, as if gravity had no hold on it. It descended silently, its needle-like fingers clicking softly against the steel as it moved. Owen stumbled backward, gripping the crowbar so tightly his knuckles ached. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice shaking. He swung the crowbar in a wide arc, the sharp clang of metal on metal ringing out as it struck a rusted pipe nearby. The whistler paused, its head tilting further, as if calculating his movements. Then it began to circle him, its steps measured. A second shadow moved in the corner of his vision. Another whistler emerged from the machinery, its limbs unfolding as it crept along the wall like a grotesque spider. The whistling grew louder, the sound now a dissonant symphony that set every nerve in Owen's body on edge. "Ezra! Mira!" Owen screamed, his voice echoing uselessly. He swung the crowbar again, this time striking the floor with a hollow clang. The first whistler stopped, its head snapping toward the sound, but the second one continued its approach, closing the distance between them. Desperation clawed at Owen's mind. He glanced around frantically, searching for something, anything, to help him. Finding nothing, he turned and ran. The factory seemed to close in around him, its labyrinthine corridors twisting and narrowing as he sprinted deeper into the ruins. Owen stumbled into an unfamiliar section of the factory, the space vast and eerily silent. Broken machinery loomed around him like forgotten giants, their rusted frames covered in layers of grime and cobwebs. He leaned against a pillar, gasping for breath, his crowbar dangling uselessly in his trembling hand. The whistling returned, softer now. Owen tightened his grip on the crowbar, his eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. He had no way of finding them without exposing himself to the creatures stalking him. The whistlers were still there, watching, waiting. Owen swallowed hard, his pulse thundering in his ears. He was their prey now, and they were in no hurry to end the hunt. "Owen!" Mira's voice echoed faintly in the distance, but he couldn't tell where it was coming from. Panic clawed at his chest as he realized he didn't know where to run. His pulse thundered in his ears, each beat a countdown to his inevitable doom. "Stay back," Owen whispered, his voice cracking. His fear turned to desperation. With a guttural yell, he swung the crowbar with all his strength, the metal connecting with the creature's limb. The whistler recoiled slightly, but its head tilted. Before Owen could strike again, Ezra's voice rang out behind him. "Duck!" Owen dropped to the floor just as a burst of gunfire tore through the corridor, the round slamming into the whistler and sending it skittering backward. Ezra stormed into view, his rifle smoking. "Get up, kid!" Ezra grabbed Owen by the arm, hauling him to his feet. The whistler, wounded but far from finished, let out a piercing screech that reverberated through the corridor. More shapes stirred in the shadows. Ezra and Owen sprinted back toward the main chamber, their breaths ragged as the whistlers closed in behind them. Jace was already descending from the catwalk, limping but alive, while Mira worked frantically to secure the coolant containers. They ran for the exit. The coolant containers, bulky and precious, were secured in the truck bed, their straps frayed but holding. Mira wiped the grime from her face and stared at the exposed engine, her hands trembling. Come on," she muttered, fumbling with wires and hoses. "Don't die on me now." "Jace, status?" Ezra said, his voice tight with tension. Jace was propped against the rusted truck, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his jacket. His face was pale, his breath shallow. "Still here," he said weakly, attempting a grim smile. His rifle lay beside him, useless in his current state. Ezra swore under his breath. They couldn't afford to lose Jace, but they couldn't linger either. Time was running out. The whistling grew louder, more distinct, a chilling melody that resonated through the factory's skeletal structure. The first whistler emerged, its elongated arms held in front, its eyes assessed the Scavengers. Behind it, more shapes appeared. "Now, Mira!" Ezra shouted. "I need another minute," she snapped, frantically twisting wires together. The truck's engine sputtered and coughed but refused to turn over. The first whistler advanced, its needle-like fingers twitching. Ezra fired, the bullet striking its shoulder and causing it to stagger. Another shot hit its leg, but it didn't stop. It moved faster, its limbs a blur as it closed the distance. Ezra fired a burst into the creature's chest. The rounds punctured its armor and it crumpled, its bioluminescent blood pooling on the concrete. But the others kept coming, crawling over their fallen comrade like a tide of black chitin. Jace, gritting his teeth against the pain, grabbed his rifle and fired into the swarm. His shots were precise, each one finding its mark, but his strength was fading. "Mira!" he called, his voice strained. "We need to move." The truck's engine roared to life, a deafening sound that filled the air. Mira jumped into the driver's seat, her face smeared with sweat and grease. "Get in!" Ezra and Owen pulled Jace to his feet, half carrying him into the truck as Mira revved the engine. The whistlers closed in, their movements faster, more desperate. One leaped forward, its claws reaching for the truck's side. Ezra turned, firing point-blank into its face. The creature recoiled, falling back into the swarm. Owen climbed into the truck bed. He took Jace's rifle through the open cab window and aimed at the approaching horde. Ezra shoved Jace into the passenger seat and jumped in after him, slamming the door as Mira floored the accelerator. The truck surged forward, its tires screeching on the broken road. The Scavengers held on as Mira steered toward a makeshift ramp formed by a collapsed section of the factory. "Hold tight," she shouted. The truck hit the ramp at full speed, launching into the air. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The ruins below stretched out like a graveyard, the horizon shrouded in fog. Then they crashed down, the impact jarring but the vehicle holding together. As the truck sped away, Mira glanced in the rearview mirror. The whistlers didn't follow. Too many to count stood on the roof, their black forms silhouetted against the gray sky, their heads tilted in unison, their small black eyes fixed on the retreating vehicle. "Why aren't they chasing us?" Owen asked, his voice trembling. Ezra didn't answer. He kept his rifle trained on the factory, his jaw clenched. The Whistlers' stillness was more unnerving than their pursuit. It was as if they were letting them go, as if the escape was part of some larger plan. The truck roared through the overgrown streets, its engine sputtering but holding. Jace slumped in the back seat, his head resting against the window. His breathing was shallow, and his hand clutched his blood-soaked shoulder. Mira gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white. "We made it," she said. Ezra leaned back, his eyes scanning the darkening horizon. The factory was gone, but the memory of the Whistlers lingered, a reminder of the relentless threat that now loomed over their settlement. As the truck disappeared into the night, the wind carried a faint sound, a low, melodic whistle, haunting and unbroken. The Scavengers' battered truck groaned to a halt just inside the settlement's perimeter, after makeshift gates of rusted steel creaked open to let them through. The air inside was heavy, dense with the smell of oil and smoke from the generators that kept their fragile sanctuary alive. It was a place meant to feel safe, a patchwork of hope stitched together with desperation. But tonight, it offered little comfort. Ezra climbed out first, his legs stiff and trembling as if the weight of the last few hours clung to his very bones. He helped Mira with Jace, the sharpshooter barely conscious, his head lolling against Ezra's shoulder as they eased him down from the truck. Blood seeped through Jace's bandages, leaving a dark trail on the dirt-packed ground. Owen stood silently by the truck bed, staring at the coolant containers strapped down. They'd succeeded, but at what cost? Only Mira had managed to hang on to her containers. His wide eyes flicked to the gates, as though expecting something to follow them through, something that had waited for the right moment to strike. "Help him!" Mira barked at a passing guard, her voice sharp and strained. Two medics rushed forward, easing Jace onto a stretcher. His groan of pain cut through the oppressive quiet, but no one spoke a word as they carried him toward the small infirmary. Mira slumped against the side of the truck, her grease-streaked hands trembling as she stared into the distance. She should have felt triumphant. She'd gotten the vehicle running. She'd helped them escape. But all she felt was hollow. The image of the Whistlers standing on that rooftop, motionless, watching them flee, refused to leave her mind. Owen finally spoke, his voice breaking the silence. "They could have chased us. They didn't." Ezra didn't respond. He was leaning against the hood of the truck, staring at the horizon beyond the gates. "They let us leave?" Owen pressed, his voice shaking. "Why would they—" "Enough!" Ezra cut him off, his tone low but sharp. "We made it out. That's all that matters." Owen looked like he wanted to argue, but one glance at Ezra's face stopped him. There was something in the leader's eyes, a weight that made it clear he didn't want to discuss it, not now. Hours later, the team gathered in the settlement's dimly lit common room. The walls were lined with salvaged metal panels, and a weak bulb flickered overhead. It was quiet, except for the faint hum of the generators outside. Jace lay on a cot in the corner, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Mira sat nearby, tending to him in silence, her hands methodically checking his bandages. Ezra stood by the door, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the floor. Owen hovered by the table, fidgeting with a piece of broken machinery, his movements restless. Finally, Jace broke the silence, his voice weak but clear. What were they doing there? The question hung in the air like a specter, its weight pressing down on all of them. Mira froze, her hands hovering over Jace's bandages. Owen looked up from his tinkering, his face pale. Ezra didn't move. "What do you mean?" Owen asked, though he already knew. Jace shifted slightly, wincing at the pain. "The Whistlers, they weren't just attacking. They were there for a reason. That factory." Ezra's jaw tightened. "We don't know that." Jace's laugh was bitter, a hollow sound that sent a chill through the room. "You saw them. They weren't just animals. They were watching us, studying us. They let us leave, Ezra. Why?" No one had an answer. That night, Ezra sat alone in his quarters. a small, dimly lit space cluttered with maps, tools, and scraps of salvaged equipment. He stared at the map of the ruins pinned to the wall, his eyes tracing the route they'd taken to the factory and back. His fingers drummed against the table, his mind replaying every moment of the mission. Jace wasn't doing well despite the medics' best efforts. They needed more supplies, and that meant going out again, soon, this time without their best fighter. A gust of wind rattled the thin walls of his quarters, and for a moment he thought he heard it. The faint melodic whistle that had haunted them in the factory. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He listened, straining to hear over the hum of the generators and the distant murmur of the settlement. It was there, soft, almost imperceptible. A whistle, carried on the wind. Ezra stood, his heart pounding. He moved to the window, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. The ruins loomed in the distance, shrouded in shadow, their outlines barely visible against the cloudy sky. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes, watching. Ezra stepped back from the window, his hands clenched into fists. He turned away, refusing to look, but the sound lingered, wrapping around him like a phantom. They weren't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. As he sat back down, the whistle faded into the night, leaving only silence. But Ezra knew it would return.